Welcome to the 99% Geek Audiobook Theater. I'm the host, Andrew Gatesy, and you've stumbled upon an audiobook podcast and companion to my site, 99geek.ca. I'm a writer with a Patreon where I release fiction novels, one chapter at a time like episodes of a TV show. You can subscribe there for only $1 a month and get access to 1,000 pages of archived material as well as every new chapter as I release them. Don't want to pay $1 a month to read ahead? You can also purchase my first book, A Suburban Fantasy, on Amazon, link on my site at 99geek.ca. But the book is included in the Patreon subscription. Or you can just wait for the podcast, which will always be a number of months behind. Subscribe or not, I hope you'll follow me on Twitter at Andrew Gatesy and spread the word about this podcast and my Patreon. There's a reason this podcast didn't start with any music, why there's no production values. I'm a penniless writer working nights at a coffee shop to pay my bills. I have only one talent, and that's the ability to tell a story. So without further ado, I've got water this time, not beer. That's good shit. Oh, wow, that's so much better than beer. And today I've got a very special story for you. A creepy story that will chill your spine. It's a horror story in honor of October. And that honor is spelt with a U, because I'm Canadian. You should probably leave the lights on. This is the Aldonn Chronicles, Book 1, The Two Guilds, by Andrew Gatesy. The prologue is entitled The Terror of Beyond, and was released on my Patreon on October 25th, 2016, for Halloween. "I'll only do story time once you've brushed your teeth," Sister Christine assured one of her kids. She was both out of breath and completely disheveled, clearly tired from a day of running after the charges left in her care. "We all know the routine now, boys and girls. Wash up first, put away all your toys, and get into bed." There was a dispute at the far end of the room. "Johnny, give Anne back her crayons, and for the sake of the gods, Andrew, put on some pants." Sister Christine must have been in her 60s now, and, though her skin was beginning to show signs of age and her hair had turned from fiery red to silver gray, there was no less fire in her than when she was 20 years younger. She ran an orphanage for children in the dense metropolitan capital city of Capson, almost entirely on her own. She'd been doing so for nearly her entire life, and nothing mattered more to her than her kids. She was their nurse mother, and their guardian, an all-seeing watcher over them. Yet she was completely oblivious of Frankie, silent and still in the shadows just outside the window, perched on the second-story ledge. No one could see her short, messy brown hair in the darkness, or her curious brown eyes, or the tight, dark brown leather trench coat she wore with hide straps and secret compartments full of tools and weapons. Frankie was a trained thief, after all, not that she was there to rob from Sister Christine. The nurse mother had raised her from childhood, as she had spent many years in Sister Christine's orphanage during her youth. Though Frankie had moved on to less greener pastures, and the sister had no clue she ever came by, she would actually do so quite often, especially around bedtime. Sister Christine's stories were famous amongst the orphans of Capson for being the best in memroxia. They often calmed her nerves before a tough job, or after, or sometimes both. The orphanage Sister Christine ran was a large building in one of the poorer districts of Capson, made mostly of wood as many of the buildings of Capson were. The upstairs bedroom where all the kids were getting in their PJs and sliding into their beds was warmly lit by a fire in the fireplace. Frankie could still remember how comfortable the orphanage had been, especially when compared to her months living on the street. Of course, she still, technically, didn't have a home. At least now, she had a guild headquarters that she could sleep at if she so chose, and a locker there within which to keep her things. She could always find a place to sleep now, even stealing away a few days in a rich aristocrat's home when they were away on vacation or business. She was more resourceful now than she was when she was a kid. She'd learned from the tough times, from the rough times, how to survive. Sister Christine went to each bed in turn, tucking in all her children one at a time and giving them each a moment of her undivided attention. "Sister Christine," a young boy called from his bed, "can we have a scary story this time?" A few other voices chimed in. "I want a scary story," another kid yelled, and they all agreed. Not until you say your prayers, Johnny, Sister Christine scolded him, to both the gods for creating us and everything around us, as well as archangels for protecting us from harm in this world of both good and evil. A young girl complained from across the room. Johnny says that archangels aren't real. Does he? Christine said in mock horror. She crossed her arms and looked down on his bed. Why would you say that? Johnny seemed like the rebel of the group, the loudmouthed troublemaker, the class clown. There was always one, and once upon a time it had been Frankie. They never answer my prayers, he complained to the nurse mother angrily. I've asked repeatedly for new clothes, for a larger bed, enough that my feet don't hang off, and cake for breakfast. You've been asking for all those things, Sister Christine mused, and Frankie could see the smirk on her face, even from outside the window. Every night, a little girl said quietly from her bed, I pray to them that they bring me back my father. The room went quiet after that, other than the nearly imperceptible sniff from the girl's bed. Frankie was pretty sure she had been Anne. Sister Christine's features softened in the candlelight, and she sat down on the end of Johnny's bed. Oh, kids, she said with compassion, do you really want a scary story tonight? Yes, one boy yelled, and others agreed with him. I won't be scared, Johnny promised, and Sister Christine ruffled his hair. Of course you won't, she said affectionately, looking then to the young girl who had spoken about her father. What about you? The little girl, Anne, was sitting up on her pillow, her covers held to her chin. She nodded. I want to hear the story, she said. I'll be brave. You're all very brave, Sister Christine told them, but this story isn't like other stories I've told you in the past. For one thing, this story is true. There was an audible gasp from a few of the kids, and Frankie settled back for a fun one this night. The story began 150 years ago in a free city beyond the king's protection, a city once named Beyond, a city that no longer exists today. ... The first time Fred set eyes on the city of Beyond, he wondered to himself why it was called a city at all. It didn't look much like a city. He would find it a stretch to even classify the city as a town. It was a smaller and poorer shanty town. The sign by the side of the road at the limits of the city should have read Beyond, the free shanty town beyond the king's protection. He had spent many years there now, building a life for himself as a trader. He had once been one of the most successful traders in all of Bemroxia. From Capsen all the way down to Tessarin, he held a monopoly on all cracker-related goods and the transport thereof. That was until a rival company swooped in from nowhere and not only ran him out of business, but out of town as well on fake charges of corruption. It took many years before he felt comfortable showing his face in the king's land again, and even then he kept to trading with outlying outposts and being a liaison between the city of Beyond and the rest of civilization. The people of Beyond were all people with troubled pasts, just like Fred, and they'd all gathered there looking for the same thing, a new beginning. It took a long time for a smelly shack in that god-forsaken swamp land to feel like a home, but as much as he hated to admit it, he was looking forward to getting back there. He'd been on the road for over a week doing his usual rounds, and his cart was full of supplies. Surprise! The first thing he thought this time, as his eyes laid sight on his dank home city, wasn't a question as to why it was called a city. Instead, he questioned why the town was so dark. It was nearing midnight, and the moon would have been high in the sky were the sky not weeping tears and rumbling with thunder. Even in a heavy storm like this, from the ridge his cart was sitting on, he should have been able to see the warm fires from within people's homes. It was a sight he'd seen many times before, but this specific occasion everything was pitch black. Spurring his horse, he cautiously made his way down the pass. Maybe there was a town meeting or something. He couldn't see the center of town from the outskirts, obscured as it was by buildings. Excuse me. But in the back of his mind, he knew there was no such gathering. Something was wrong. It was a feeling in the very depth of his stomach he didn't want to acknowledge. It was a stench in the air, an unsettling quiet relieved only infrequently by the storm. Even his horse was restless. He could tell. It pulled against the reins and tried repeatedly to pull the whole cart around. He got as far as the town sign before the horse would go no farther. And then a flash of lightning told him why. It illuminated, if but for a brief moment, the corpse of a man impaled onto the signpost the sign stood. His belly was cut open, and grotesque viscera, what looked long and stringy, like they might be his intestines, were strewn across the town sign, obscuring its message. A bloody smear stained the ground, making a path that led forebodingly towards the center of town. Excuse me. Water burp. Alright, his horse yanked so hard on the reins that the entire cart could no longer hold it back. The cart tipped over and Fred's horse broke free to run into the safety of the dark swamp. Fred was thrown free from the cart and landed in a deep slough of mud. He let his horse go, no motivation to chase after it. Perhaps it was being smarter than him. He should have turned then himself and never returned to that city of beyond. Instead, he unhooked his club from his belt and took an unsteady step forward. His trusty club had been with him for years, his weapon of choice ever since he'd managed to fight off a lone bandit with it once. Tightening his grip on it gave him confidence enough to take the next step, and the one after that. His legs were strengthening, only to then buckle again as lightning flashed in the sky once more, and Fred could see the blood smeared on the walls of the buildings around him. Many doorways opened with trails of blood stretching out to all lead towards the center of town. Many doorways laid open. Excuse me, sorry. Always correcting. Anyway, as the light of the lightning faded, another light did not. Some sort of warm glow was emanating from the town square, it seemed, though it didn't seem much like firelight to Fred. The light felt unnatural, giving him shivers and goosebumps on his skin where it touched him. By the time he was able to steel himself again, he was once more lying in the mud. He felt weighted now as he got up and crept forward. His clothes were soaked and weighed 30 pounds. Each footstep sunk deep into the mud nearly up to his knee. He was cold. The rain was punishing and unrelenting. Still he pressed forward, avoiding the main road and creeping in from the shadows. For all the blood he could see, Fred was surprised as to the lack of bodies besides the one he saw at the limits. There was enough blood here for 100 men, and yet, where were they? Was this some kind of animal attack? Had everyone he'd ever known just been eaten in the night? Mrs. Buckers from the pharmacy ripped apart limb from limb? But then, what was that glow? As he got closer to the center of town, he could feel his hairs all standing up, and there was a cackling in the air around him. Even sparks, it seemed, were flying from a nearby fence. Had lightning struck nearby? He came out of the final alley and immediately crouched behind the nearest merchant's cart. What he saw over that cart and through the dead fish that hung from it was like nothing anyone in Memroxia had ever seen before. There was a man standing on a podium beside the well in the center of town. He was old and had a wrinkly face that could have belonged to a man in his 90s. But he wasn't standing with the posture of an old man. His back was straight, and the way he wielded the black curved dagger in his hand didn't show the slightest sign of feebleness. Not while he brandished it about chanting, and not while he slipped it slowly into another man's chest. The man's scream was so agonizing and shrill that Fred had to cover his ears. The smell was so terrible that he wanted to cover his nose as well, but he only had 2 hands. Fred recognized the man just murdered as the mayor's husband. Both men were illuminated by a large fiery ring in front of the well, and the old extravagantly robed man pushed the other man off the podium into the fire. The heat blazed up, and Fred could see the old man was soaked with blood that the rain could do little to wash off. The man cackled something fierce, and Fred was glad to be still covering his ears from the last horrific sound. That was when Fred realized what was fueling the ring of fire. It was bodies, piles and piles of bodies, seemingly of every person in the town, even the women and the children, even the orphan children. There were so many bodies in the town square that they were strewn just about everywhere, but a large majority were placed deliberately in a circle. Or was it a circle? Fred tried to peer higher over the cart and get a better sense of the pattern set aflame in the center of his once pleasant city. The circle had lines going through it, almost like a star, or, he mused as he fell back behind the cart, a pentagram. Had the old man seen him? Another look over the cart seemed to suggest not. He was far too busy enjoying himself. "By the blood in my body," the old man roared loudly into the night, "in that which I've spilt!" His voice seemed to echo around the town square unnaturally in a low guttural tone. "By the soils so bloody where once civilization built," he continued, the building storm only accentuating his insanity, "I cast my voice up higher and higher, to bring down an angelic being of which I aspire." Lightning flashed as he said his last words, one large, immensely powerful bolt striking with force unknown to the center of the pentagram. The bolt was blindingly white, and thick enough around to fit a man. Energy from the bolt seemed to snuff out the fire around the pentagram, only to trace its own glow against the bodies of the dead. And though Fred didn't think he had much surprise left, to his surprise, a golden-greaved boot stepped from the white energy of the lightning onto the blood-stained mud. The light dissipated back into the sky, but darkness did not envelop in its wake. The light had left behind a figure, massive and glorious, with gleaming gold armor that matched his long locks of blonde hair flowing down to his midriff, and, sprouting out his back, beautiful, blindingly bright wings of light. The old man laughed from the podium, his cackling laughter sickening Fred to his stomach. "It worked!" the old man chided, seeming very proud of himself. "Speak, angelic one!" the old man roared at the being before him. "Tell me your name, for I am Radavar, High Mage of the Council, Lord of Souls, and fueled by death itself." The angelic being he was speaking to took a long time before it finally spoke back. "That is a lot of titles, human," it said, voice booming and echoing around the city like the old man's had, but this voice was even deeper and silky smooth. It seemed to shake Fred to his very core and stop his heart, if but even for a moment. He had never known such terror as he had known that night. He was not going to make it through the night with a clean pair of undergarments. "I am Aldonn Ardner, Archangel of the High Heavens," the painfully bright being continued. "And I am not a lesser demon that you can summon at your whim, I am not a lesser demon that you can summon at your whim, necromancer." Radavar crossed his arms, not seemingly nearly as shook as Fred, who was frozen in fear. "And yet," he said loud and guttural, "I have you, sir, trapped on this plane and under my power." It was because of the night, where horrors never ceased. The bodies that lay at the Archangel's feet began to stir and animate. They exploded open with blood and viscera. The bones of every fallen man, woman, and child tore themselves free of their bodies to rise as glowing, red-eyed skeletons adorned with hanging slabs of meat and torn pieces of garment. They surrounded the heavenly being. "You will bend to my will," Radavar roared at Archangel Aldonn, "and lead my... No, you will die." Sorry, I went a little emperor there. "You will bend to my will," Radavar roared at Archangel Aldonn, "and lead my armies on a great crusade, transforming this world into one of my visage." Radavar pointed his dagger at his captured higher power, the blade glowing but faintly against Aldonn's illuminance. "What say you, Aldonn of the High Heavens?" The Archangel looked around the square, and at all the horrible loss of life. at the horrible creatures Radavar had summoned around him. It was not fear that Fred saw on Aldonn's face, and it certainly wasn't respect. Fred saw only disgust, and for a moment Fred could have sworn Aldonn had looked directly at the fish cart, that the Archangel's gaze had lingered on his chosen hiding spot. But the Archangel's attention then turned to the dangerous man in front of him. "You did indeed snatch me from the high heavens," the Archangel Aldonn told Radavar in his booming voice. "But I am not," he continued, and then he stepped beyond the once flaming pentagon of now exploded bodies, "as you would assume, mortal, under your power." The dead around him all made a loud screech. I'm sorry, that sounded more like an oink. I mean, a pig dying or something. The dead around him all made a loud screech, and those farthest away began to run at breakneck speeds towards the Archangel. The rest quickly began to follow suit. The glowing behemoth that was Aldonn watched with nary a gleam of concern, brandishing what looked like the hilt of a sword in his hand and nothing more. The dead were almost upon him, and it seemed for a moment that he would be completely overrun by them. But suddenly the sword hilt in his hand seemed to alight in flame, and the Archangel traced the hilt through the air. It was as if he was literally drawing himself a sword in midair, built of fire itself. By this point, one skeleton was so close as to lunge into the air for the Archangel's head. But, without looking, it was as if Aldonn knew it was there, and he enveloped the skeletal creature in the fire of his sword. As the blade swung through the air, only dust remained of the creature, but there were many more in its stead. Brandishing his mighty blade, he disintegrated a skeleton to his left. Swinging it around in a flourishing swoop, he expertly carved a large swath through the skeletal armies descending on him from the right. "You are a revolting creature," he said, giving a moment to throw his intimidating gaze towards the necromancer Radavar. "I will find peace in burning your abominations to ash and wiping your stain off the face of this realm." He was swinging with wild abandon now, cleaving away at the seemingly endless horde. In fact, there seemed to be more dead clamoring in from the swamp, and coming out of the very ground at their feet. Fred was distracted then from the apocalyptic battle as skeletons swarmed in from the alley behind his cart, and one took notice of him. With a screech, it was upon him, clawing at him. Screaming, he crawled through the cart and fell to the floor on the other side. Through the fish, the skeleton reached out after him, and Fred's hand found the hilt of his club, his trusty club. It seemed little more than a sharpened stick now. Would it be as effective against a skeleton as it was against that bandit? A scream made Fred almost drop his club as the skeleton got its ribs tangled with the hanging fish on the cart. What's going to happen? Brandishing the club like a bat, he swung it with all the strength he could muster into his arms. His weapon tore through the skeleton, bashing the skull into pieces and then shattering the ribcage like it was nothing. That had been easier than he'd been expecting. "Kill them!" Fred heard Radavar yell from the podium in the center of town. Kill the Archangel!" The town center was overrun with dead now, and Aldonn swung his mighty sword over his head, the fiery blade flicking around him more like a whip than a sword. He swung it again, and again in a circle, and enveloped himself in fire that radiated out to disintegrate every single skeleton in the square, and even the ones crawling on the rooftops above. Somehow, it was as if the Archangel was able to avoid licking Fred with his flames, leaving just the traitor untouched. Even the buildings around him were beginning to engulf in flame. The fire had disintegrated every skeleton in sight, but hopes that would be the end of the entire ordeal were quickly dashed as more skeletal soldiers came into view. They really were unrelenting, and Fred couldn't help but wonder from how far away they might be running. The next town over? Did the necromancer's will reach all the way to the dead bodies in Capson? The mighty Archangel Aldonn stopped swinging his flaming whip around and watched the replenishing horde approach. Fred wondered what was going through the mind of the blonde-haired being as the Archangel saw the inevitability of his plight. Again it seemed like the heavenly being Aldonn had looked right at him. This time Fred was consumed in his stomach with a sudden compulsive urge to hide, and he followed his gut. He was running on instinct at this point, and couldn't really have accomplished much else. Underneath the rubble of the fish cart, Fred dove. covering himself in the suit so as to blend in. From his hiding spot he watched as Aldonn was again overrun by skeletons, but this time he took to the air, lifting off to the sky, though it didn't seem as though his wings were moving much at all. The entire village was aflame, and skeletons were jumping on top of each other for a chance to nip at Aldonn's heels. Aldonn's sights were set on Radovar, and nothing seemed likely to hold him back. Radovar, too, seemed fueled by an unbreakable focus, and his hands were cackling with energy. "You want to challenge me?" he roared up at the Archangel from his podium. "With the power of 10,000 dead flowing through my veins?" His hands were glowing now, a bloody red, and he made fists with them, bringing his fists together to release a large beam of red energy. The red energy seemed unstable, curving and wavering, surging through the air at Aldonn. The Archangel held his flame sword away from the beam, raising his other hand to glow a brilliant white. The light formed a sort of glowing orb shield that flowed from it. The light formed a sort of glowing orb shield that flowed out from his golden glove. The light formed a sort of glowing orb shield that flowed out from his golden glove in waves to block the attacking beam. That was a fun sentence. When the two forces connected, the boom was deafening. Tendrils of energy shot in all directions, one tendril exploding the wall of a building it struck and adding to the already spreading fire. From where Fred was lying, it looked to him as if he were viewing the ultimate clash between light and darkness, like he'd just stumbled upon it on his way home. The climactic final battle between good and evil, all the powers of good focused into a shield of light, repelling all the darkness from across the world focused into one concentrated beam. More explosions rocked the town as tendrils of energy ricocheted away from the Archangel. Finally, Radovar gave up, relinquishing the beam and lowering his hands. It was too late, however. The town, already so devastated, there was no hope of saving it. Perhaps there never was. Radovar's hands came together and blood seemed to bubble up from his palms. Holding the blood aloft in midair, with magics Fred could not possibly conceive, Radovar shaped the blood into the likeness of a sword and took hold of it. Just like that, the old man was holding a sword of his own, dripping perhaps a little more than Aldonn's mighty blade of fire. "I am a god!" Fred heard Radovar yell at the top of his scratchy old lungs. The old man charged the Archangel with blood sword brandished high. One swing was all Aldonn needed, the flaming blade shattering Radovar's sword like glass. With a backhand, Aldonn swatted Radovar, much like a bug, across the town square and through the wall of a burning building. "Power is an intoxicating thing," Aldonn said softly, his voice still booming across the remains of beyond. "It's deceptive, can never be trusted." He lifted into the air and followed in the direction he'd thrown Radovar. Few dead remained to challenge him. Fred didn't know where the courage came from for him to follow after the Archangel, but that he did. A surviving skeleton made for him with a screech, but the traitor easily battered the dead creature to pieces with his club. 3 for 3. By the time Fred made it to the edge of the burning hut, Radovar was already at Aldonn's feet, cowering away from the bright glory of the heavenly being. "Know this, mortal," the Archangel said to the old man. Radovar seemed almost pathetic now to Fred. Pathetic and weak, not at all the scary, imposing figure that had destroyed everything and everyone Fred had ever known. "I have dined with gods," Aldonn said, taking a step towards Radovar. Radovar scurried away, pressing his back against the burning wall. "You are no god," Aldonn finished his thought. Finally Radovar spoke, but it was a labored effort that belayed his pain. "The Mage Council grows in strength every day." He struggled to spit his words at Aldonn. He was trying to laugh, but his laugh was haggard and broken. "We're experimenting with darker and stronger magics. It's only a matter of time before we challenge even your power." "Not you," Aldonn corrected the necromancer, raising his fiery blade above the old man's head. "One day Radavar roared with everything he had left. "A mage will be strong enough to make this planet bow!" The Archangel Aldonn stabbed his sword directly into Radavar's chest. "And on that day," Aldonn's voice rung out as the mage disintegrated into flame. The Archangel turned then to Fred standing in the mouth of the wall. "I'll be there to stop them," Aldonn said, and he seemed to give Fred a reassuring nod before disappearing in a beam of light. Fred was now all alone in the ruins of the once not-so-great free city of Beyond. The kids in the orphanage were silent as Sister Christine finished her story. The breeze around Frankie... I forgot to say dot, implying a change in scene. The kids in the orphanage were silent as Sister Christine finished her story. The breeze around Frankie had picked up, and she hugged herself in the cold night air. Sister Christine had glanced at the window. Did she know Frankie was there, like the Archangel and Fred? "So you see," she told Johnny, "Archangels are far too busy protecting the world to fuss themselves with our petty concerns and prayers." Johnny stirred in his bed. "He wouldn't think my concerns so petty if he'd tasted your oatmeal," the kid said sleepily. He yawned and closed his eyes against his pillow. "I want to be an archangel when I grow up," said the little girl Anne, who had complained about her father earlier. "Dummy," another kid said, though he had been pretending to sleep. "You have to be born an archangel." "Are there little archangel babies in heaven?" a different kid asked the nurse mother. "Yes," Sister Christine said sarcastically, getting up from Johnny's bed, with little archangel baby wings sprouting from their backs. "Now go to sleep, children." She tucked in one kid, but the others were all happy, it seemed, to roll over and close their eyes. The story had taken a lot out of them, and despite their promise, Frankie was certain a few of them had gotten scared. Sister Christine approached the window as if to close it, but she peered out instead, looking at exactly the spot Frankie had been hiding. The sister didn't see her, however, as she had already climbed to the roof and peered down on her from above. "Good night, Sister Christine," Frankie spoke down at her, shrinking into the shadows as the sister peered up at the sky. "Good night, stranger," the nurse mother said quietly, her expression belying that though she might not have known it was Frankie, she wasn't afraid. Frankie had never seen her show fear the entire time she'd known her. The sister closed the shutters of the window as Frankie took off across the rooftop and jumped over the alley onto the roof beside. She had somewhere else to be. The leader of her guild, so Frankie had been told, had picked her specifically for a most important theft. She wasn't told exactly what she needed to take, just given an address and told it was imperative the place be sacked by morning. Some jobs were about stealing something, and then leaving the place as if it hadn't been disturbed. That took a particular set of skills, and was effective at keeping heat off the theft for as long a time as possible. But other jobs were more concerned at the act of stealing, instead of what was to be stolen. Those jobs were more about sending a message, and they weren't Frankie's specialty, but she could enjoy herself a little, she supposed. Dropping to street level after crossing the street by rooftop, Frankie stopped at a streetlight and surveyed the building she'd been led to by the address scribbled on a scraggly piece of paper. "Seems like the place," she said to herself, opening the lantern hanging from the streetlight and setting her scraggly note aflame. "Guess it's time to stop talking to myself and put on my big boy face." She talked to herself a lot when others weren't around, but when she pulled the black scarf over her mouth and the hood over her head, she became more than just a foolish loudmouth. She became a master thief, perhaps even the best thief in Capson. She disappeared into the shadows behind her. A young bohemian couple in flourishing garb were trundling up the cobblestone street despite the late hour, and Frankie waited until they were looking away before she bolted like a blur across the road to the target building. As she effortlessly climbed the side of the building to the window she decided would be her entry point, and with the easiest of motions she snaked a wire beneath the frame of the window to unfasten the latch. With an equally smooth and silent motion, Frankie had the window open, and she was inside as if she'd always been there. Though the place was dark, Frankie could make out the lavish red curtains and solid gold upholstering. Frankie was going to be dining fine tonight. "This will be easier than I thought," Frankie whispered to herself, surprised by at the lack of security or traps. She started for a diamond necklace hanging on the wall first, when a voice froze her in place. "Maybe not so easy," a sharp accented voice spoke from the darkness. A match was lit from the chair in the center of the room, and a man in armor put the match to a candle on the little table beside him. He shook the match out and smiled to Frankie. "You've been set up, thief." Frankie recognized the man in the chair as Christopherson, the head of the King's Guard. The feather in his helmet all but said exactly such. He was flanked by two lesser guards, both with far less extravagant armor than their boss, and he raised a cup of tea to sip the hot beverage with what must have been cool satisfaction. "Don't run," Christopherson told Frankie, but it was too late. The thief had already dived out the window. "After her!" Frankie could hear the head of the guard yelling to his men. Frankie aimed for a wagon of hay parked against the wall, but missed by just a smidge and smacked the cobblestones hard. The pain was blunt, and especially bad on her back. Groaning, it took her more than a moment to get to her feet. In that time, Christopherson poked his head out of the window. "Units 1 and 2 are a go," he yelled loudly down the street. As Frankie got up, she spotted a couple kids walking their dog, and they had clearly seen the whole fall. "Shh!" she told them, putting her finger to her lips. She pulled herself to her feet shakily, still smarting from her tumble. Thankfully, it had only been from the second story. "This is why you don't jump from windows," Frankie said to the kids in warning, crossing the street once Christopherson had disappeared back through the window. "Even if it seems safe," she told them as they laughed at her, "you can't trust people who always line up the piles of hay for the convenience of types like us." She gave them a wink and then got immediately distracted. There was a noise from down the street, and it seemed Christopherson had brought backup. "Gotta go," she told the kids as a squadron of guards, 6 or more, turned the corner with large square shields and spears. Frankie booked it down the street, turning a corner of her own into another street, only to find more squadrons of guards waiting. They were led by another important man in the King's Guard. Bill Nader was in charge of maintaining the watch over the city wall. He was Christopherson's right-hand man. "Freeze, thief!" Nader yelled at Frankie. Frankie dropped her arms to her waist and twisted her wrist slightly so that a throwing knife dropped from her sleeve into her hand. She did that 2 more times so that she was holding 3 daggers, one between each finger. Did she forget to mention she was also a master knife thrower? She threw her blades at Nader, who cowered behind his raised shield and blocked all 3. They thunked into the wood of his shield, and Frankie could hear him mutter, "I hate thieves." By the time Nader lowered his shield, Frankie had already disappeared into an alley. "Stop her!" Frankie heard Nader yell, and she didn't have to look to know they were right behind her. She knew she didn't have much time and made straight for the manhole cover. The sewers, after all, were a thief's friend. It was to her complete and utter surprise, then, when the manhole cover didn't budge an inch. "Locked?" Frankie said loud in continuing surprise. A slit on the manhole cover opened, and she could see eyes. There was someone on the other end, and they didn't immediately speak. "I'm an agent of the Thieves' Guild," Frankie told them. "This month's password is trust." Starting to seem a little ironic. "I'm sorry, Frankie," the voice said at last. Frankie didn't think she recognized it. "Just following orders." It was then that a hand grabbed Frankie by the scruff of her neck and pulled her away from the cover. "We've got you now," Nader said as the guards surrounded Frankie with spears aimed dangerously close to her jugular. Wait, Frankie yelled to the crowd around her. "Before this all gets unpleasant, just answer me one question." All the guards around her looked down with anticipation. "Who in the hell set me up?" The only answer Frankie got was a sharp pain to the back of her head, and then the pleasant black of oblivion. ... Frankie woke up in a dungeon to the sounds of a woman screaming somewhere in another room. It sounded like she was getting tortured, or maybe it was a man getting very tortured. Either way, it was a sound that didn't suit Frankie much at all. There was hay on the floor where her head was now resting, but it smelled wrong, and Frankie was pretty sure the cell hadn't been chained, or... There was hay on the floor where her head was resting, but it smelled wrong, and Frankie was pretty sure this cell hadn't been cleaned out in a long time. What had happened? Where had they taken her? This wasn't the city jails. She'd seen the inside of those many times before. And she wasn't alone in her cell either. There was another man there with her, but this man was tied to the wall by his wrists, and looked far more uncomfortable even than Frankie. "You okay there?" Frankie asked the man, trying to see the man better in the darkness. He was handsome, and had flowing long blonde hair, down to his midriff that seemed to glow even in the near darkness of their cage. "Didn't realize they were going to be co-ed rooms," she muttered to herself. "I would have booked a different hotel." And that's it. The end of the prologue to the Aldonn Chronicles. Special Halloween edition for this Halloween, this October. I made a bunch of mistakes there at the end. I apologize. My voice was losing it a little at the end there, but I think that overall, hopefully that was an enjoyable listen. Hopefully you found it creepy at points and scary, and maybe not that scary, but it certainly also sets up what's going to be a very exciting series. Not always horror, but there is a new Halloween-themed chapter that I just wrote this month to be released on my Patreon. It's also for the Aldonn Chronicles, chapter 4, I believe. So it's 4 chapters away from here. So that means that if you wanted to catch up, you could subscribe to my Patreon, and you could read another Halloween chapter before the end of the month. I'm not lying, and it's only $1. For $1, you can get not just this book, which currently is at 127 pages, but also the Adrift Homeless series and the Suburban Fantasy series. There's vampires, there's space, and there's medieval fantasy. Like, that's 3 unique genres providing unique stories, unique entertainment. It's absolutely worth checking out. That's 99geek.ca, 99geek.ca. Don't spell out the 9, just use the number 9, 99geek.ca. And then you'll find my Patreon there. This thing to subscribe. It's only $1. Just $1 a month. So that's $12 a year. The price of a pack of cigarettes a year. The price of a meal at McDonald's a year. The price cheaper than a coffee a month. Like, you're telling me that you're not willing to pay $1 for good stories like this and not have to hear me read them? I mean, that's got to be a plus too, right? Anyway, so again, the chapter should be up before the end of the month. I'm guessing somewhere around the 20th. I will have the chapter online at patreon.com/99geek. Oh, I should have added that it's free. Holiday-themed chapters I generally make free on my Patreon, so even if you don't want to subscribe for $1, go back there. Let's say, do it on the 20th. The chapter will be there by then. Wait, let me check my watch. My Apple Watch here. The 20th is a what? Is a Friday, yes. Yes, go back on the 20th, it will be there. And check it out, it'll be good stuff. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew Getzy, that's G-E-C-Z-Y, and hopefully you know how to spell Andrew. I mean, maybe you're not a writer, I'm the writer, so it's A-N-D-R-E-W-G-E-C-Z-Y. There you go. Andrew Getzy. You'll also be able to find all that spelled out in the description below. And subscribe to this. Thank you for your time. May the force be with you. Oh shit, that's probably copyrighted. Not May the force be with you. 99 Geek, we are the 99%.